All right, guys. So we're back, and today we're taking a look at colonial era movements. This is a big deal because while these aren't specific events that take place, they're much broader in scope. And they go a lot deeper in terms of helping to form the foundation of our identity. They're kind of written into our DNA and they make us who we are. Now, these are worldwide movements, but they're going on not only in places like Europe, which is where a lot of these things begin, but also because there's so much movement between the European continent and the colonies, we're seeing them begin to take root right here as well. So, the very first one that we're going to see is the scientific revolution. This is, again, a big one. It's happening all over the world, although a lot of it is taking place in Europe. Again, it's also taking place here. And the big thing with the scientific revolution is we're beginning to place a very high emphasis on science. We're looking very heavily at logic and reasoning. And again, there's also a very high emphasis on education. So those are really, really big deals. What we're going to see is that because you have a higher emphasis on science and education, those things, that literacy is going to skyrocket. The literacy rates are going to really improve. Now, they were already really good here in the colonies in places like New England, right? The Massachusetts area, the Rhode Island, and up in that northeast area. They were very good because of the influence of the Puritans, who placed a high emphasis on education because they wanted us to be able to read the Bible, right? Interpret things for ourselves. But the interesting thing is that when literacy rates go high, you can read and you can interpret anything. It's not limited to only the Bible or religious texts. So, with higher literacy rates and an emphasis on logic, what it really means for us is that, especially in the colonies, new ideas are going to be able to take root. Think about that. New political ideas, new ideas about power and who should have it, and all of those sorts of things. So, those things are going to spread like wildfire here. This is very fertile ground because we're able to read and pass along information in that way. So that's the first big one, is the scientific revolution. There are all sorts of inventions. There's all sorts of discovery, and they're all important. We had very big figures here in the colonies, a part of that scientific revolution. Think Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, right? Both very scientific minds, both inventors and writers of the first class. So it does play a big role here. The next one that we're going to see is the Enlightenment. Oh, the Enlightenment is where the rubber hits the road. This is a very, very big one. Again, something that's taking place over in Europe, but because of all the travel and transportation and the immigration, we're seeing a lot of people from Europe come to the colonies, and they're bringing with them the ideas of the Enlightenment. So, with the Enlightenment, people are beginning to question the nature of really everything, and including the nature of things like power. Who gets to have power? Who gets to rule, and why? Not only who has power, but does power come with responsibility? Because up until now, kings pretty much did what they wanted to do, and everything that they did. Well, you can, well, maybe for their country, but really so that they could stay in power. It was for their own benefit. And the idea now is that, well, if you are given power, do you have a responsibility to those you rule over, right? So people are beginning to ask really important questions like that. They're asking questions about things like natural rights. Well, what rights do we have? And does everybody have certain rights? And if so, where do they come from? And what happens if somebody impedes on those natural rights or tries to take them away? So there's a lot of really important questions about government, about power, about how it's gained and who has the right to have it. And again, if you have power, do you have a responsibility to use that power for more of the kind of common good? Those are very important questions. Some of the big thinkers have an enormous impact on this country. One of the big ones, my favorite here, John Locke. Locke is the one who kind of comes up with the idea, in large part, of natural rights, and he includes among those natural rights. By the way, he says that those are things that every human being is born with, right? You are given those rights upon your birth, and including life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Now, Jefferson obviously borrows heavily from John Locke, and the ideas of Locke form the foundation, the very backbone of our Declaration of Independence and the idea of our kind of government, right? And the responsibility that it has to the people. So John Locke was a heavy hitter, and we borrowed very heavily from him. He influenced us greatly. Another guy that I want to point out here is Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu is the one that is the founder of the idea that there should be separation of powers, right? That government could grow too large and ultimately would grow too large and too powerful for one person. So let's split it up. We're going to have an executive. We're going to have a legislative branch. Does that sound familiar, right? The way our government is formed, we have separation of powers. So these are two big time heavy hitters among, I should say, many, many others, right? There were other influential, Rousseau, Voltaire, right? Just to throw a few names out there. And they weren't all in favor of our style. They weren't all terribly influential for us. Some kind of had a very different point of view, like Hobbes. But our big guys, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Locke, had an enormous influence on the shaping of our country. They never set foot here. They didn't know much of anything about this continent or the people who lived here, but the ideas that they had formed the foundation of what our current government is, right? And what it has been largely from the beginning. The ideas of life, liberty, the pursuit of property, separation of powers, separation of church and state, freedoms of the press. Those are all the kinds of things that these guys were talking about. The consent of the governed. There's a lot of things going on here, big time topics. Now, the next movement that we're going to take a look at, it's called the Great Awakening. Now, the Great Awakening is really one that is specific to the North American continent. This is not going on in Great Britain to the extent that it's going on here. This is a big deal. So, excuse me, there we go, the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening is a spiritual reawakening, right? It's a revival of sorts, right? That's kind of a churchy word, but it's a revival, a reawakening of spiritual nature in the American colonies. A lot of people go, well, wait a minute, weren't we founded by all of these Puritans? Didn't we have all of these separatists and so forth that really kind of founded us? And we do, but we're talking about this has taken place in the 1730s, 1740s. So it's been 100 plus years since those folks got here. We've maybe started to fall asleep at the wheel a little bit when it comes to our religion. It had grown dull. It had grown very boring, and maybe overly restrictive. So what we're going to see in the Great Awakening is just that, a reawakening. There's a greater emphasis on individual spiritual individual religious experiences. Spirituality is much more personal in that they preach about having a personal relationship with God. And so these are kind of new ideas that we're placing emphasis on. It enlivens the church. It enlivens the country. All of a sudden, people feel as though these preachers are speaking to them. It becomes a much more personal and individualized experience. Because of that, a lot of people return to church, or a lot of people come to church for the first time, and we become once again a deeply religious uh, uh, geographic area, right? These colonies. Now, I want to make sure that we point out that while it does kind of unify us in a common belief and religious experience, there's also a little bit of division because we start to see new denominations form, right? And so they get to be a little bit territorial, which happens in religion sometimes. So it's both unifying in some respects and creates division in others. Now, I want to point out a few of our key figures here, and these guys are on your packet. They're in your reading. They're very, very important. The first is a fellow by the name of Jonathan Edwards. Now, he was a preacher, very well known throughout the colonies. In fact, very well respected even still today. A lot of his sermons are pointed to and kind of recreated and quoted. But his most famous is one called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he kind of talks about how God is angry with sin and with sinners, and it kind of paints this picture of what hell is like, and how God is kind of dangling these sinners over these eternal fires of hell, over these pits. It was scary. He was a powerful speaker. He was an emotional speaker, and it frightened the hell out of some people in a pretty literal sense. They were clamoring to come to know God a little bit closer in order to avoid those things, right? And so that's one of the preachers of that era. There were many others that emulated him, that had that style of very persuasive and kind of were able to paint a picture in people's minds using their words. Now, on the other side of that, we're going to have guys like George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield was an incredibly influential pastor. He was an itinerant preacher, meaning he didn't have his own church. He came from England and he traveled all over the colonies. Everywhere George Whitefield went, people came from miles around to hear him speak, miles and miles around. In fact, he rarely ever spoke indoors. More often than not, they would build something for him at the base of a hill so that he could speak in almost natural amphitheaters and people could come and sit on the hillside. He had an incredible ability to make his voice heard and really project. And so he would speak to thousands of people everywhere he went, all up and down the colonies, right? Now, his was a little bit different, right? He spoke of a kind and loving God, a gentle God, a God who loves us and desires a relationship with us. Certainly, more what you might find in churches today. Um, I look at these two guys in an interesting way. They didn't necessarily work together. They didn't speak at the same places at the same times. They were kind of working at the same time, but not in the same places. But both of them were very, very effective. And the reason is because people are touched by different things, right? For some who would ignore the kind of images of the angry God are going to be drawn to the images of a loving and forgiving God that George Whitefield painted. For some who could easily ignore the messages of George Whitefield, they were terrified of the image of God that maybe Jonathan Edwards was preaching. So, are both of those true in the Puritan and Christian ideas? Of course they are, right? God is a God of judgment, but God is also a God of forgiveness. So they're both talking about the same God. They're not contradicting one another. They're choosing to focus on one aspect of God's character rather than the other. And because of that, they were kind of working in tandem. Even though it wasn't technically working together, their messages worked in tandem to really reach wide audiences. I kind of think about it as a donkey, right? If America's a donkey, there's two ways to motivate. Positive reinforcement, that would be George Whitefield. Think of somebody sitting on the donkey's back with a carrot on the end of a stick, right? Positive reinforcement. That donkey's continually moving forward in order to try to get that carrot. On the other end, if it's Jonathan Edwards, he's not using a carrot, he's using the stick, right? He's going to whip that donkey, going to scare that donkey, going to bring pain to that donkey in order to get it to move forward. Ultimately, the goal and the effect were both the same, to move people closer to God in the colonies. They just had different ways, different means of achieving that. So, anyway, these Great Awakening preachers are also teaching equality in the eyes of God. So, a more personal relationship and greater equality. Nobody has greater standing in the eyes of God. Nobody has greater standing in heaven. That we were all equal in that respect. So those are our three major movements, right? We've got the Enlightenment, we've got the Great Awakening, we've got the Scientific Revolution. Hopefully, you're able to see how each of those things began to have an influence on the shaping of the American identity, whether it be through higher literacy rates, through the asking of questions about political power, or through viewing ourselves as equals, right? And if we're equals, then surely no king who was ruling by divine right for generations and generations had the authority to kind of continue to rule over us. We're going to start to ask some serious questions. So these three things are really kind of planting seeds in the hearts of the American people. And those seeds, sometimes generations later, are going to come to fruition. When you add that to the idea of mercantilist policies, right, and the anger about what the British were doing, when you add that to things like the policy of salutary or benign neglect, which if you haven't watched, you will here shortly, right? When you add all these things together, then they create a pretty potent soup for creating maybe some discontent, but also for kind of writing upon our DNA a very, very strong sense of independence. So, anyway, with that said, I'll go ahead and end that. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you next time.